For months, Queen Camilla moved with an almost unsettling calm, her public appearances marked by impeccable decorum and deliberate restraint. There were no slip-ups, no missteps, only a regal poise that felt just a touch too calculated. The tabloids sang of her evolution into a seasoned consort, yet behind those pristine smiles, something more dangerous was unfolding. Whispers had begun swirling across palace corridors, too subtle for headlines, but far too coordinated to ignore. It started with the unexpected resignation of a longtime aide known for her loyalty to Catherine. Then came the hushed tones among senior courtiers, and a notable shift in communication patterns between royal departments and Montecito. But the real warning sign was the disappearance of a document whose existence was already half legend, the Protocol Clarion. A charter buried in the annals of internal monarchy governance, one believed to dictate the boundaries of royal alliances and what constitutes an foreignate, act of constitutional disloyalty. Harry, long isolated by scandal and self-exile, had been unusually coy in recent months. Questions about his position, his future, even his sentiments toward the Queen Consort were met with hollow nods and diplomatic platitudes. It was out of character. This was a man who once unleashed raw fury on international television, and now nothing but vague smiles and evasive non-answers. Meanwhile, Camilla, once the very symbol of rigidity in her disdain for Sussex drama, was quietly consolidating power. Long-trusted members of the senior staff were reshuffled. William and Catherine were subtly but unmistakably excluded from select ceremonial planning sessions. Access to certain royal archives was suddenly restricted, especially those relating to Queen Elizabeth's final months. Then came the courier unmarked, discreet, but seen nonetheless by a keen-eyed palace insider. The destination, Highgrove. The recipient, Queen Camilla. The contents, unknown. But from that moment forward, the Queen's posture shifted. Not publicly, but in the way she engaged with the machinery of the monarchy. She was no longer simply preserving her place. She was playing a longer, riskier game, one that required her to do something no one expected: extend an olive branch to the man who had once tried to burn the institution down with truth bombs and televised revelations. And yet, there was no doubt. Camilla had a plan, one that defied every known royal instinct. She wasn't reacting. She was orchestrating. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. But to understand why Camilla would ever consider reaching out to the very man who threatened her place, we must rewind to a series of hidden confrontations that the palace buried until now. It was never supposed to reach Balmoral. That remote, storied estate, shrouded in mist and silence, was meant to be sacred ground, a retreat from the chaos of court life. But it was here, in the heart of Scotland's royal fortress, that a sealed envelope changed everything. Charles, flanked by Princess Anne and a discreet royal archivist, convened a conversation that was never intended to leave the room. No aides, no courtiers, just blood, legacy, and uncomfortable truths. The topic? A long-buried provision within the monarchy's internal governance structure, the legacy clause, a whisper of policy thought to be obsolete, drafted in the wake of Princess Diana's death, and designed to ensure that any future Queen Consort's influence could be curtailed should the line of succession come under question. Until now, it had been theoretical. But something had shifted in Charles, something Anne had pushed for quietly, a desire to prepare for transition not just of crown, but of control. Camilla wasn't in the room. But the palace has a way of leaking its own sins, whether through a cracked door, a mirrored corridor, or a much misplaced copy. The contents of that discussion found their way into her hands. And what she read didn't just shake her, it incinerated every assumption she had built her standing upon. The legacy clause was more than a symbolic relic. It referenced a genealogical audit, a comprehensive review of bloodline legitimacy and suitability for future influence. And Camilla's name, position, and past connections were disturbingly absent. Her role, according to that document, was not future-proof. It was optional. She wasn't the monarch's anchor. She was a placeholder, and even worse, Charles had reportedly agreed to consider re-evaluating her ceremonial prominence should external pressures mount. It was a betrayal, not by tabloids, not by Meghan or Harry, but by Charles himself. The man who had promised her permanence had traded her legacy for palace stability. In the hours that followed, Camilla did not lash out publicly. But behind closed doors, she began constructing a counter-offensive. She demanded reports. She initiated subtle reshuffles within her inner circle. She authorized discreet information pulls from the palace archives, targeting correspondences between Diana, Elizabeth, and certain clerks who once advised the Queen Mother. And then came the most damning move of all, a confidential call made from her private line, traced through diplomatic encryption, routed toward a source closely tied to Prince Harry. No one expected it, least of all Camilla. But when legacy was threatened, loyalty became expendable. She didn't need allies she could trust. She needed ones the firm feared. This was no longer about her public image or her relationship with Charles. It was about survival. Camilla understood now that there were forces even within the royal fold willing to erase her influence for the sake of public favor or political optics. If she couldn't secure her legacy through lineage, she would do it through leverage. And if that meant aligning, however cautiously, with the exiled prince once set on destroying her, then so be it. What Camilla uncovered was enough to ignite her fear. But what she did with it is where the story truly twists. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't forgiveness. When Camilla reached out to Harry, it came not through direct contact, but via a royal godparent, a figure trusted by both sides, but ultimately loyal to neither. The message delivered wasn't long, nor was it emotional. It was cryptic, precise, and impossible to ignore. A single line stood out. "We must speak before the Sandringham blessing is reversed." For Harry, the reference struck a nerve. That term, the Sandringham blessing, had surfaced in hushed conversations during his final weeks as a working royal. It hinted at a covert pact signed by Queen Elizabeth herself, ensuring protective status for future heirs. But the full scope of the document had always eluded him. Now, years later, the person invoking it wasn't his father, nor his brother, but Camilla. A woman he had long held responsible for his mother's erasure from the royal narrative. And yet, he didn't dismiss the invitation. He paused. He weighed, and then, under the guise of a philanthropic appearance, he agreed to a non-verbal meeting on neutral ground. Meghan, notably, was absent, not by accident, but by condition. Camilla had made it clear, this initial contact had to be free of external complications. It was the first power move of many, setting the tone for what was never going to be a reconciliation, but a negotiation built on mutual leverage. Camilla didn't approach Harry as a stepmother or a peacemaker. She approached him as a strategist, fighting a silent war against the one royal faction that had outmaneuvered her at every turn, William and Catherine. She had watched their image ascend untouchably. Their influence spread beyond the confines of royal tradition. They were no longer just heirs, they were the monarchy's brand. And that left Camilla, despite her crown, standing in the long shadow of a couple the world viewed as the rightful future. If she wanted to reclaim authority, she needed to split that axis wide open, and Harry, with his global reach and unresolved grievances, was the key. What she proposed was simple on the surface, but seismic beneath it. Public neutrality from Harry, no interviews, no innuendo, no memoir follow-ups, just silence. In exchange, she would use her influence behind the scenes to reframe his narrative within the institution. No rehabilitation, but no erasure either. By pulling Harry away from open warfare, she would simultaneously isolate William, making him appear overly rigid and paranoid. And by excluding Meghan, she ensured the dynamic stayed volatile, split, controllable. Camilla wasn't building a bridge. She was laying a trap, one that might fracture the William-Catherine stronghold from both ends, exposing the very fault lines the monarchy feared most. Sibling rivalry weaponized from within. But Camilla wasn't the only one playing chess. Harry had a vault of bitterness, and he wasn't about to be anyone's pawn without rewriting the rules. He didn't come to bow. He came with terms. When Harry stepped into Camilla'S calculated proposal, he brought not hesitation but fire. Gone was the disillusioned prince begging for dignity. In his place stood a man who had tasted exile and turned it into armor. His silence, the very currency Camilla sought to buy, came with a price, and it was steep. The first demand was a direct challenge to the institution's hierarchy. Inclusion in all key family councils during any period of Charles's health decline. Not ceremonial appearances, but real influence access to documents, advisors, and transition planning. Camilla flinched. It meant placing Harry inside the very conversations she hoped to shape. But this was just the beginning. Harry's next move cut deeper. He demanded the dismantling of long-standing media alliances closely associated with Camilla'S private press operation. For years, carefully placed stories had shielded her while casting shadows elsewhere. Harry wanted that machinery shut down, those relationships severed, or at the very least, exposed. No more anonymous quotes from unnamed senior palace sources. No more behind-the-scenes narrative manipulation that quietly turned public sentiment against Meghan or painted Catherine as the untouchable foil to a supposedly chaotic Sussex household. Camilla realized then he wasn't just negotiating, he was exacting retribution, but what came next was more personal than tactical. Harry demanded access to the Queen's vault, specifically to the sealed correspondences between Diana and the late Queen Elizabeth, documents reportedly locked away after Diana's death, never made public, never acknowledged. Rumour had it those letters contained fears, foresight, and blunt warnings about the very dynamics Harry now found himself caught in. Camilla had long feared those files being unsealed. Granting access was tantamount to releasing a ghost, but Harry held the upper hand. Her agenda couldn't move forward without his complicity. And so, she stalled, neither confirming nor denying the vault's accessibility, but clearly shaken. Then came the demand for a royal reframing. Camilla would have to publicly endorse a rebranding of the Sussexes not as outcasts, but as independent Commonwealth partners, a term she loathed for its implication of autonomy. It would grant Harry and Meghan soft power, charitable reach, and diplomatic visibility without tethering them to the traditional royal pecking order. It was a shift Camilla couldn't fully control, and one William would see as a direct threat to his streamlined monarchy model. Yet she nodded, just barely, knowing her hand was forced. Only then did they agree, in veiled language, to bury their past wars. No more back-channel leaks, no more televised grievances. But only for as long as mutual benefit persisted. The détente was conditional, and with a chilling final clause, Harry made one thing unmistakably clear. If Meghan's name was invoked, if she was dragged into the mud again, he would walk. No matter the cost, no matter the fallout. For Camilla, the alliance was no longer just a clever maneuver. It was a precarious tightrope walk through a minefield of bitterness, legacy, and revenge. As Harry crafted his counterstrike, another figure observed from the shadows, one who knew Camilla too well to trust the surface peace. Unlike others who relied on visibility and control, Catherine had mastered the art of stillness, of watching not just the words spoken, but the spaces between them. The subtle pauses, the shifting rosters, the sudden absences that went unexplained. At first, it was minor. A standing briefing she'd routinely led was rescheduled without notice. Then another. Soon, entire chains of internal communication that once flowed through her were rerouted, bypassing her completely. What alarmed her wasn't the exclusion, it was how smoothly it had been done. No confrontation, no warning, just silence wrapped in procedure. Someone, somewhere, was pulling strings. And it wasn't Charles, it wasn't William, it was Camilla. She knew it when two of her most trusted aides, individuals who had served through the darkest days of the Windsor Rift, were quietly reassigned to Clarence House, reportedly at Camilla'S strategic discretion. No one dared admit it outright, but the timing was too precise to be coincidental. It was surgical, intentional. Catherine felt the walls narrowing. She knew what it looked like when a rival began isolating you without saying a word. She'd seen it before in tabloids, in history books, in courtrooms. This wasn't politics. It was erosion. Then came the slip. A junior equerry, barely in his second year, mumbled something under his breath during a rehearsal. "Is this before or after Harry's clause kicks in?" he asked a senior aide, unaware that Catherine had entered the corridor. He froze the moment he saw her, his complexion drained of colour. The phrase clung to her like frostbite. Harry's clause. Not a rumour. A clause. A condition. Something official enough to be referenced, yet secret enough to be dangerous. That night, Catherine confronted William, not with accusation, but with clarity. She laid out the shifts, the whispers, the strange courier traffic to Montecito. William's response? Muted. Not defensive, not dismissive, just tight-lipped and too calm. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She reached out to the only other royal who could cut through obfuscation, Princess Anne. In a private conversation that would never be recorded, Anne didn't deny what was unfolding. She only offered a single cryptic warning: they've reopened the vault. Catherine didn't need further explanation. She knew the vault Anne meant. The one housing documents never meant for sunlight. The one that, if weaponized, could dismantle more than reputation. It could alter succession, influence, legacy control, and public trust. Catherine moved swiftly, but silently. She activated a private plan she had sketched months prior, during the first tremors of instability. Protocol, Eclipse, a contingency framework designed to shield her children, preserve William's position, and if necessary, expose any unauthorized alliance that threatened the monarchy's long-term structure. She hoped never to use it, but hope was no longer enough. The pieces were moving, and the crown's core was shifting under her feet. But before Catherine could act, an unexpected leak burst the alliance into full public scrutiny, and the consequences were brutal. One early morning, a heavily redacted document arrived, anonymously in the inbox of a senior editor at one of Britain's most watched but least trusted tabloids. No note, no signature, just a subject line: Clarion Override, Excerpt 3A. Within minutes, that editor knew they had something incendiary. What began as speculation about Camilla'S quiet maneuverings and Harry's ambiguous re-entries into royal proximity exploded into cold, hard evidence. The leaked transcript, its authenticity unconfirmed, but its content damning outlined the bare bones of what insiders had whispered for weeks. Camilla, it alleged, had actively explored ways to override or circumvent William's future standing in favor of an alternative balance of power, one that strategically included Harry under carefully negotiated constraints. It wasn't a coup, but it wasn't far off. Worse still, the transcript included language that set social media ablaze. Terms like media disarmament, narrative reversal, and intergenerational asset redistribution fueled every corner of speculation. The most chilling phrase? Future-proofing the throne. It suggested long-term restructuring not of figureheads, but of influence, perception, and public loyalty. It implied that Camilla and Harry were not merely collaborating in crisis, they were co-architecting a vision that removed William from the untouchable pedestal his parents had died building. What shocked the public even more was what wasn't in the document. Meghan's name appeared only once, cryptically labelled non-operational asset, a cold bureaucratic phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Had she been shut out, sacrificed as a condition of Camilla'S alliance, or was she always meant to be a ghost in this arrangement? By midday, the headlines were relentless. War in Windsor. Camilla and Harry caught in succession plot. Future-proofing the throne leak sends royals into meltdown. Is William being erased? Paparazzi descended on Montecito like locusts, while Clarence House faced an onslaught of reporters camped outside the gates, demanding answers. Neither side responded, but silence, in this case, only deepened the noise. Across the Atlantic, Palace spokespeople issued carefully worded statements of ongoing evaluation and miscontextualized material. But they didn't deny the document, not outright, and that omission spoke louder than any denial could have. King Charles, reportedly recovering from a health procedure when the leak hit, was informed hours later by Princess Anne herself. Sources close to the family claim his reaction was subdued but unmistakably grim. The damage was done. Whatever remained of internal unity had shattered in a single morning. Within the hour, royal legal teams initiated containment protocol, a crisis response designed for reputational emergencies but rarely deployed. Briefings were suspended, access was restricted, phones were confiscated from junior staff. In certain wings of the palace, entry logs were erased entirely. But amidst the fury, someone was curiously silent, and their silence was about to become the loudest voice in the room. For weeks, King Charles remained shrouded in silence as the palace crumbled into scandal. While voices outside the gates screamed for accountability and factions within the firm twisted in turmoil, he remained still recovering, yes, but also calculating. Those closest to him saw the weight settling in his eyes, the quiet fury of a monarch forced to reckon with betrayal from within his own house. The world speculated endlessly. Would he defend Camilla? Would he punish Harry? Would he shield William or distance himself from them all? Then, without fanfare, a single parchment appeared, hand-signed, stamped, and released through the court circular. It was not filtered through advisors. It bore the unmistakable marks of personal authorship. And the only one present, as it was written, Princess Anne. The statement was brief, measured, but unmistakably sharp. There were no names, no explicit references. But the message was thunderous in its restraint. The strength of our future lies not in division, but in unity without manipulation, it read. And then the line that brought gasps across Britain and beyond. The throne is not inherited, it is earned. That one sentence reverberated through the marble halls of Windsor like a crack in the crown itself. Analysts scrambled to interpret it. Some argued it was a pointed rebuke of Harry's veiled attempts at leverage, but most understood it for what it truly was, a devastating censure of Camilla'S maneuverings cloaked in royal dignity. Charles had not exiled her, but he had publicly and unmistakably drawn a line between the monarchy and anyone seeking to reshape it through schemes. Camilla, who had been bracing for support, was reportedly blindsided. Private vulnerability from a woman who had survived decades of scrutiny. Her next 3 scheduled appearances were quietly cancelled, cited as unavoidable scheduling conflicts, but no one believed that for a second. She had been benched silently, symbolically, and thoroughly. It was a strike from the very top, executed not through confrontation, but through constitutional precision. She had wagered everything on influence, and Charles, in 12 carefully chosen lines, had made it clear she had none to spare. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Harry responded in his own way. A cryptic post appeared on a Foundation-linked social account. Some fires burn coldest when unseen. No further context, no interviews. But the message was unmistakable. He was watching, waiting, perhaps regrouping. But the damage, as far as Charles was concerned, had already been done. The royal house could no longer afford quiet conspiracies masquerading as strategy. Trust had been shattered. Now came the reckoning. And just as the world reeled from Charles's words, a long-forgotten royal clause roared back into relevance and threatened to erase everything Camilla thought she'd secured. It was buried for decades until now. Hidden deep within the annals of constitutional tradition, the Sunset Clause was drafted during the Queen Mother's era as a fail-safe, a dormant safeguard to prevent undue influence from infiltrating the crown through the consort. Few knew it existed. Even fewer believed it would ever be used. But its purpose was razor-clear. In the event a royal consort was deemed to have formed a compromised alliance with an external or non-linear figure, particularly one whose actions threatened the sovereign's legacy, their influence could be nullified through regal and ceremonial action. The clause had been forged in the shadow of the abdication crisis, when fears of foreign entanglements and romantic scandal nearly fractured the monarchy. Now, decades later, the conditions it described were no longer hypothetical. They were playing out in real time, and at the heart of them stood Queen Camilla. Her covert dealings with Prince Harry, an exiled, non-senior royal stripped of titles, and deeply estranged from the institution, fit squarely within the threshold of non-linear compromise. The leak of their collaboration didn't just fracture trust, it triggered a formal reassessment. Behind the palace gates, royal attorneys, many of whom had never before uttered the words "sunset clause" aloud, began pulling ancient parchments and annotated briefings from sealed vaults. It was no longer about damage control. It was about constitutional integrity. An anonymous senior courtier, speaking under strict conditions, confirmed what the public had feared. Yes, they are considering invocation. Camilla, once so secure in her transformation from mistress to monarch, now found herself staring into the abyss of royal erasure. This wasn't just about public opinion or press optics. This was structural, legal, historical, and irreversible. Her entire role hung by a legal thread, a thread she had never believed could snap. She had played her hand boldly, betting on influence through alliance, but the very move meant to preserve her power had opened a door she never should have touched. Reporters cornered William outside a military engagement just hours after the leak. His response was blistering in its brevity. No one is above the charter. It was a statement with sharp edges, delivered not just to the press, but to the palace itself. The message was unmistakable. If the crown was to endure, even those who wore it by marriage would not be spared accountability. At the same time, Meghan's eerie silence raised further questions. Her name had been scrubbed from every official angle of the scandal, but insiders whispered that her calculated withdrawal from the public eye might not be disengagement, it might be preparation. For what? No one knew. But the absence was deafening. Now, the monarchy stood at a precipice. Camilla's legal status, her ceremonial authority, even her public titles, all of it risked being stripped away under an arcane but suddenly relevant doctrine. The walls were closing in, and there was no script for what came next. But even as the legal gears grind in the background, one final confrontation looms, and this time it's face-to-face, in full royal theatre. It was not a meeting. It was a reckoning. Behind the fortified doors of Windsor, 4 figures entered one by one, each arriving alone, each carrying the weight of a fractured monarchy. Camilla, Harry, Catherine, William. No aides, no press, no crowns, just unfinished war dressed in royal silence. Insiders would later call it the Final Four Summit, but those who knew better described it as the moment the monarchy stopped being ceremonial and started becoming personal. The air was thick with history and hesitation, and in that room, legacies were either salvaged or sentenced. Camilla was the first to speak, sources say. Her voice was composed, her argument clinical. She did not deny the alliance with Harry. She reframed it. She called it a necessary intervention, a safeguard against the uncontrolled narrative spiraling beyond the palace gates. I acted to protect the crown, she allegedly said, from itself. But the justification landed with a hollow thud. Harry, who had said nothing up to that point, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words cut deeper than any accusation. You never protected anyone but yourself. The line, cold and final, rang with years of unresolved betrayal toward Diana, toward him, and toward the institution that let it all happen. Camilla blinked but didn't reply. Catherine, poised yet visibly hardened, followed next. Her tone, while calm, was immovable. We choose legacy, not leverage, she stated, turning what had been a private code into a public declaration of principle. It was a refusal of manipulation, of hidden deals, of the erosion of tradition masked as modernization. In that moment, she wasn't just defending her husband. She was defending the foundation of the monarchy itself. William stepped forward next, his statement cloaked in composure but sharpened by intention. He didn't repeat the sunset clause by name. He didn't have to. His words were clear. We will act in accordance with the Charter, no matter how painful that may be. It was a veiled ultimatum, a reminder that no one, regardless of title, was beyond the reach of royal law. Camilla looked at him but said nothing. The silence was louder than any protest. And then, it ended not with a royal decree, but with 3 separate exits. William and Catherine left together, their steps aligned. Harry left alone, his face unreadable. But Camilla stayed seated. Alone, surrounded not by allies, but by the ghosts of decisions made in secret. Her fate was no longer in her hands. And as the others stepped out into the cold light of consequence, she remained suspended in the uncertain twilight between power and punishment. And so the alliance that began in shadow ends under scrutiny, but the question remains, what else is buried in the royal vaults, and who has the key? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.